Right, so I'm going to do a little bit now before we sing a song of worship. Basically it's a recap because we've had sort of a week's break and I want to just sort of get us back into the swing of where we are. Before I start though, and this is the last week, and I just wanted to say thank you for coming. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate how much you've engaged with the material and been willing to listen and been willing to dive into it. And I suspect that some of you have been maybe a bit skeptical about bits of it along the way, but you've gone with it anyway and sort of thought, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I'm going to keep going and I'm going to be critical about it and engage my mind, and I'm hoping that I don't mind if you disagree with bits of it. I'm absolutely fine with that. But what I hope is that it has led in some way to some sort of encounter with God and some sort of deeper understanding of who he is and what he does through the person of Jesus. If it hasn't done that in you, then I'm sorry. Because my aim here really is to engage your minds and get you thinking about stuff really deeply. But if that doesn't change your heart and your soul in some way, if those two are left unconnected, then there's no point. So thank you for coming and thank you for going with it. Thank you to Phil as well for filming them. He's been amazing. Can we just give Phil a big thank you. I don't need to thank. Do I need to thank anybody else? I suppose Daniel, who isn't here, for letting me do this, for trusting me with this. So thank you to those people. If you want to respond to this, feel free to email me afterwards, and anytime you like, come up and see me at church and chat through this stuff with me. I'm happy to try and answer questions and to discuss anything that you might want to discuss. I'm really happy to do that. So let's have a quick recap of where we are. So we ended a couple of weeks ago with Jesus on the cross. We talked about how Jesus goes to the cross as Adam. He is the perfect human being. He does what Adam should have done. So instead of grabbing things selfishly for himself, he instead gives himself for the good of others. He acts as humanity should have acted in the garden. We also talked about how he is God on the cross, how the people project onto him their fears, they mistrust him, they characterized him as something he's not, and they crucify him, they kill God on the cross. So he's Adam on the cross and he's also God on the cross. And finally we said that he is the serpent on the cross to complete the sort of Garden of Eden trifecta. He is the personification of our sin, which is what the serpent is really. And so Jesus is the perfect man, he is God, and he is also our sin. So Paul talks about Christ, who knew no sin, became sin for our sakes. He becomes sin. And in looking at him on the cross, we look at our sin and we see that which is killing us being crucified. And all these things together, and it's this multi-layering thing that has to happen, all of these things together are what brings our salvation. On the cross as well, and this is something we didn't mention, but it sort of taps into something that we've looked at in previous weeks, that there's Exodus language as well. So on the cross, Jesus asks for a drink, and he's given it on a branch of hyssop. And it's really interesting to me that in the Exodus, a branch of hyssop is used to daub the doorposts with blood to stop the angel of death from visiting that household. And so Jesus on the cross becomes that doorpost, daubed with blood, to protect us from death. Isn't that beautiful? And the doorpost serves another function in Exodus as well. So the people who are within that house, the angel of death passes over, and they are eating a meal. And then after they finish their meal, they walk out into a good new creation. They're on their way to the Red Sea. And so Jesus is also that doorpost through which we enter a new creation. And then last week, for those of you who came to communion, and I had a really profound experience at communion, actually. I really loved it. It was beautiful having the sets that David had built and the scene that we entered into and the story that we stepped into. I loved that idea. And so I talked last week a little bit about how Jesus, as this sort of prelapsarian human being, the Adam before the fall, he goes to the cross and he dies as Adam dies on the tree of death. And so we talked about how John in his gospel paints this beautiful picture of the cross as a tree in the middle of the garden. Do you remember this way that he structured his gospel? And this is the place of death, John says, which I found wonderful. And so Jesus dies on the tree of death, as Adam does, in the middle of the garden. But Jesus transforms that tree of death into the tree of life and gives us access once again to the fruit of the tree of life. And so we have this multi-layering. So Jesus fulfills the prophecy of Genesis 3. He crushes the serpent under his feet. He pins sin to the cross. But also, as the serpent, he is crushed by humanity. So Paul talks in Romans about the God of peace will crush the serpent under your feet. This is like a humanity doing it as well as Jesus doing it. It's an individual person and the collective humanity who both do this. And what we get is humanity working in partnership with God once again in bringing about new creation. So as the serpent, he's rightfully killed, really. This is what Adam should have done. They killed the serpent. But also he's unjustly murdered because he's also God. And he suffers death as Adam. The death that Adam was never meant to suffer, but Jesus enters into it with us. So he shows real, true empathy. This quote, for me, kind of sums up what Jesus does on the cross when we're talking about rebuilding the tree of life, or turning the tree of death into the tree of life, and giving us access once again to the fruit of the tree of life. So this is from a 6th century Greek hymn, and I don't know if it was sung or whether it was liturgy, but this for me is beautiful language. It says, now the flaming sword no longer guards the gates of Eden. It's been mysteriously vanquished by the blood of the cross, by the wood of the cross. The sting of death and the victory of hell have been vanquished. For you, O my Saviour, have come and cried to those in hell, enter again into paradise. And Christians in the Eastern Church in the 6th century were singing this stuff, or saying this stuff. The cross provides entry again into Eden. This is the sort of language they used. Another early church father, I think it was John Chrysostom, but I might be wrong, so sorry to John if it wasn't him. So in the book of 1 Peter, it says that Christ, when he dies on the cross and goes down into Hades, he preaches to the souls in Hades, and then offering them salvation. And a lot of the early church fathers sort of take this image and they sort of run with it, and they come up with stories and ideas about how this would have looked. And they use this kind of storytelling to talk about the triumph over the power of sin and death, and the triumph over the power of Hades. So John Chrysostom says that when Jesus went down into Hades, he wandered around the prison cells looking for someone. And finding the right prison cell, he takes the keys. And Revelation 1 says that Christ holds the keys of death and Hades. And one of my old lecturers, who I should probably thank as well, a guy called Brad Jerzak, it's a really interesting guy. He says that if Christ holds the keys of death and Hades, what do you think he's going to do with them? It's a really interesting question to ask. And so Chrysostom says that he takes the key and he unlocks the cell door, and he leads Adam and Eve out by the hand and leads them up out of Hades. Isn't that a wonderful image? We get this idea as well in this passage. So this is a quote from the Gospel of Nicodemus. So the Gospel of Nicodemus, I'm sorry you can't really see that properly on the screen. So the Gospel of Nicodemus it's not a gospel, nor is it written by Nicodemus. What it is a sort of a 3rd to 6th century, we're not sure exactly when it's written, theological response to the Gospels. And what I've read of it, it seems pretty theologically accurate to me. It seems like it's pretty bang on with a lot of stuff. So this is what early Christians were writing in response to the Gospel. And this is another sort of fanciful story about Hades and what Jesus achieves in Hades. And it sounds very similar to what John Chrysostom is saying. So it says, Hades receiving Satan, so Hades is sort of personified in this passage, said to him, "Turn and see that not one of the dead has been left in me. For all thou hast gained through the tree of knowledge, all hast thou lost through the tree of the cross." And it goes on. While Hades was thus discoursing to Satan, the King of glory stretched out his right hand and took hold of our forefather Adam and raised him. Then turning also to the rest, he said, "Come all with me, as many as have died through the tree which he touched. For behold, I again raise you all up through the tree of the cross." Thereupon he brought them all out, and he took them and sprang up out of Hades. I love that kind of idea of what Jesus is achieving on the cross. This is complete triumph over the power of death. This is what he offers to people. And I love this idea of raising up Adam and Eve, this kind of restoration in the image, this restoration to what humanity should have been. And this is what we're going to look at tonight. So that was a little bit of a recap, a little bit of a nuancing of some of the stuff we've looked at so far. And we're going to look at ways in which the image of God works post the cross and post-resurrection. But first, let's sing a song of worship. Let's get our heads and our hearts in the right place to hear this sort of stuff. So, Phil, would you put that on? Thank you. Sorry, if we've been using film terms all the way through this series, for those of you who may not have been here for all of it, just to kind of give us a bit of a way into thinking about this as a story and how we enter into it as a story. So we're thinking about this as a denouement. A denouement is a French term, basically means like the conclusion of a film, but after it looks like the film might have ended. And like it's sort of a postscript. And the resurrection works like this a little bit because yes, Lord, more Lord. Yeah. Yeah, the laptop's been resurrected. Yeah. Yeah, if we stopped with our theories of atonement at the point at which the laptop died, then it would be no worship song at all. Yeah. Where was I? I said denouement. So in a sense, the resurrection works like this because the disciples think the story is over. They think that they think that John 19 is where it stops. And John 20 seems to come as a bit of a surprise. It seems to sort of leap out of nowhere. I mean, like the Gospel of Nicodemus says, he sprang out of Hades. it's like he's leapt out and suddenly like, oh, this is a bit weird. What's going on here? It's a whole new thing. So to get our ideas about how the resurrection works, we're going to go back to Genesis. We're going to think about the resurrection event and the stuff that Jesus does following it in several ways, and they're kind of multi-layered. John likes his layers. So one of the things we're going to look at is day 6. So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, we looked at how the new creation works in John and how John structures his gospel. So he has the 6 days of creation. So day 1 is John 1, where he describes Jesus as the light of the world. And in Genesis 1 we have let there be light as the first act. In John's second day we have water imagery. In day 3 we have bread. So the separation of the water from the land, and then all this kind of stuff that's going on. But we never did day 6, because day 6 is the resurrection. Day 6 is recrafting humanity in God's image through the person of Jesus Christ. So these two slides here, so this one and this one, are slides from the new creation talk that we had a couple of weeks ago. So I'm not going to dwell on these on the screen. They're purely in your handout so that you can refer back to them if you forget. I don't know how you could forget what happens on the different days of creation in Genesis. So what I want to argue is that Jesus begins a new creation at the cross. And I think that, to me, this is fairly self-evident, the ways in which John structures his gospel and the ways in which John talks about Jesus at the cross. So we've already talked about him transforming the tree of death into the tree of life, how he's the doorpost through which they enter a new creation. So this is kind of what the multi-layering is about. So while this is day 6, after the cross we have day 6, where you remake man in the image of God. In another sense, it's also the first day of a new creation. And so we have this layering going on. And we'll add another layer in a minute. In fact, we'll do the other layer now. So something else that was happening in John, I don't know if you remember this, I mentioned it fairly briefly, I think. There are 7 signs in John. A lot of theologians will talk about this as being representative of the 7 days of creation. This is kind of a fairly common motif. What we didn't look at was the ways in which these 7 signs parallel the days of creation in Genesis. I think partly we didn't cover it because I hadn't thought of covering it, and partly because it's not obvious. A lot of people don't sort of look at the links between them. I don't think... No, okay. So, this is the other layer, I think. So, resurrection is day 6, where you recraft man in the image of God, and we'll get to that in a little bit. It's also the first day or the first week of a new creation. But also, it is... I don't know how to phrase this, really. No, I don't know. I'll come back to that. I think what I do need to say is that the 7 signs are separate to John's days. So while John splits his book up into days of creation, so the light, the water, the bread, and so on, the signs don't sort of fit neatly into those days. So the water into wine, which I will argue parallels the first day of creation, is actually on John's day 2 if you split the book up in that way. So he has different layers of splitting his book up. Does that kind of make sense? If it doesn't, go with it.
John's Gospel is not meant to make sense.
It's John's Gospel, it's not meant to make sense. Well, I don't know. I think that a lot of what John does, it does make sense to his original reader. The problem is that we read it 2,000 years removed from the original readership. And so we have to sort of interpolate and dig into what he's meaning. And we'll get to this in one of the days, actually. So day 4 is complex for us, but I think self-evident for his original reader. So in day 1, we have the water into wine. So John says that this first sign, and don't forget that John signposts these. He says, he clearly maps it out. He says that this is Jesus' first sign. And with the healing of the official son, he says this is his second sign. And the idea is that he wants his readers to look out for more signs and to sort of track them through the book. And he says that this first sign, the water into wine, reveals Jesus' glory. Now in John 1, Jesus' glory is described as light. So in the water to wine story, we have Jesus, who is the light, being revealed over water. This is the first day of Genesis. Let there be light. In day 2, we have the healing of the official son, and it says that he goes back to Cana, where the water into wine story took place. And so immediately in our minds we have this image of the water jars separated, right? And what happens in day 2 of the Genesis story, you have a separation of water. And there's a lot of sort of above and below language intimated in the healing of the official story, in the healing of the official son story. And which might lead us towards separation language. So you have the idea that he's sick and then he's well. And don't forget that in Genesis, the separating of the waters is a separating of the chaotic waters. And so the chaos that God separates peacefully into good creation might be symbolic of sickness or death. And it says the official son is going to die, but Jesus rises him up. He's down and then he's raised, and you have this sort of separation idea. On day 3 we have a healing at Bethesda, and this is interesting because the man who is healed believes that he can only be healed if he goes into the waters when the waters are being stirred. But Jesus heals him on the land. He says, well, you don't have to go into the water, I can just heal you here. And so you have a separation of water and land that you get in day 3 of Genesis. Now, day 4 is complicated. I'm going to cover it in slightly more detail. Because I think the feeding of the 5,000 covers day 4 of the Genesis story. Which, if you remember, is the sun and the moon being given authority over the day and the night. Now, how does that work in the feeding of the 5,000? Right, so I think that this is one of those instances where John says things that are fairly self-evident to his original reader, and we just don't get it. So John is writing into a context where Israel is occupied by Rome. Now, Rome has a lot of interesting religious beliefs, and I think we probably know about a fair few of them. Israel is also very Hellenized at this point. It's very Greek influenced. They've also come out of exile in Babylon. A few hundred years previously, but Babylon has some interesting religious beliefs as well. And something that all these cultures have in common is the idea of astrology. And the idea that of star signs and the zodiac. And so in Babylon you have Zoroastrianism. In Rome and Greece you have the pantheon who have these ideas as well with the cosmos. And I think John is sort of tapping into this sort of well-known astrological language of the time to paint a picture of Jesus, and to paint a picture of what's going on in the feeding of the 5,000. And now that's not to say that John thinks that astrology is true, necessarily. I think he's just using clear cultural references that they would understand. And we get this in the other Gospels really clearly as well, like with the Magi, when they go to see Jesus. They're astrologers. Like, they see signs in the heavens and they go and find the true king. So the Gospel writers are fairly comfortable with this idea. So if we go with that for a second, I think the 5 loaves that he feeds the crowd with, I think they're probably representative of the 5 planets that the Greeks are aware of. So they're aware of, I'm aware that I've got an astronomer in the audience here who's covering his face. So they're aware of Mercury, at the time they're aware of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. Is that right? Yeah, nailed it. So I think that they're representative, effectively, of the known universe, the 5 loaves of bread. And then at the end of the story, they gather up 12 baskets. Well, what's 12 in astrology? It's the signs of the zodiac. This is the whole cosmos. And what's interesting is that they only gather up leftover bread. There's no leftover fish. Have you ever noticed that? So you have the 5 loaves and you have the 12 baskets. I think that this is representative of the cosmos. And who has authority, then, over the cosmos in this story of the feeding of the 5,000? Who has authority over it? No, not Jesus. The disciples. Yeah, so Jesus gives authority to Philip and Andrew, specifically. Now, John has mentioned already in his first chapter that Philip and Andrew are from Bethsaida. Does anyone know what Bethsaida means?
House of something.
House of something, yeah. Not bread. Good guess, though. That's a great stab. You're so close, it's unbelievable. The house of fish. Yeah. Philip and Andrew are both from Bethsaida, which is the house of fish. So there are 2 of them, and there are 2 fish in the story, right? So perhaps in this story, Andrew and Philip are the fish, which are representative perhaps of the sun and moon that have authority over the rest of the cosmos. And this is kind of what the Greeks and the Romans believed, particularly the Romans. So here's a picture of a 1st century relief from Rome. So we think it's from about 30 AD, which is interesting. This is called the Resi Zodiac. I'm sorry, it's a bad picture. It's, I think it's been lost and they've only got a picture of it now. So this is the best we can do. So around the outside, we have the 12 signs of the Roman zodiac. And on the inner circle, we have the corresponding signs of the Egyptian zodiac. In the middle, as the axis on which the zodiac turns, we have the sun and the moon. There's also something else in the middle that you really can't make out on that picture. The other thing in the middle is a serpent, which should make our ears prickle. Because John has already specifically described Jesus as a serpent in his gospel. In John 3:14, Jesus says, "I will be a serpent like the one that Moses lifted up in the wilderness." So in John's language, this is fascinating. Perhaps the feeding of the 5,000 is symbolic of day 4, because it says that Andrew and Philip, the fish, the sun and the moon, are given authority over the cosmos, the 5 loaves of bread and the 12 baskets that represent the zodiac, and at the center of the story is Jesus, the serpent. So I realize that is speculative. And I'm seeing some nods. It's highly speculative, and I have no evidence really with which to back that claim up. And I don't really mind if you disagree with me.
What claim? That Jesus is the serpent?
No, not the claim that Jesus is the serpent. More the claim that John is using this kind of language to describe what's going on in the feeding of the 5,000.
John 3 talks about as the serpent was lifted up, so Jesus would be lifted up.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you can really say there's an equivalent, that Jesus is the serpent.
In the sense, well, okay, so Jesus compares himself to a serpent in John 3.
Because he's lifted up on the cross as the serpent is lifted up.
Okay, so your pushback on that, and it's a perfectly valid one, is that Jesus isn't comparing himself to a serpent per se, more that he's saying he'll be lifted up like the serpent was lifted. Okay. There is a difference, but my personal view is that he is comparing himself to a serpent as well, because I think that there are clear links, as I have tried to show, but I might have failed, that the story that Jesus references in Numbers also has clear links back to Genesis and the Garden of Eden with that serpent. And Jesus becomes sin that is personified by that serpent. And I mean, Paul says that Jesus becomes sin for us. And the sin is characterized by a serpent in the garden story. So I think that there is a clear through line from the Garden of Eden through Numbers and up to John and the ways in which John talks about Jesus. But you are very welcome to disagree with me on that.
I find it difficult to actually go along with your language of Jesus being the serpent.
Okay. Because you identify Jesus so much with Satan, perhaps? Or...
Well, do you think Satan exists? Do you think the serpent is the same as Satan?
I think that the biblical authors come to associate the serpent with Satan. Is that the same thing? I'm not sure. I think that Satan is probably a personification of evil and sin and death caught up in an individual being. And does Jesus play that role on the cross? I can understand why you'd be distrusting of that idea. But then you have to think about, so Paul says that Christ became sin for us. It doesn't say that he triumphed over sin. It doesn't say that he took on the appearance of sin even. It says that he became sin. That's very strong language. Okay, so what's the difference though? Because the serpent, to my mind, is a personification of sin.
I suppose I have some struggle with, you'll talk about method acting and Jesus plays every part.
Yeah.
I don't see that clearly in the scriptures.
That's okay. That's fine. As I say, I'm happy for you to disagree with anything that I say. If it gets you thinking, and it clearly has in your case, David, that's enough for me, I think. I'm perfectly happy for you to disagree with me on at least aspects of this. I'm not trying to convert you or to get you to join my little cult or anything. I'm more trying to give us ways of thinking and language that we can use to help us to understand bits of a story that's complicated, right? Jesus' atonement is a really complicated thing, and these ideas have helped me to think about them more clearly. But if they're unhelpful for you, if that language is really unhelpful for you, feel free to dismiss it out of hand. And I can understand why it would be unhelpful. I'm just trying to tell you where I'm coming from, I guess. And I hope that I haven't said anything heretical or out of bounds at any point. And I'm sorry if I have. I haven't intended to. And the language that I've used has sometimes been odd and has sometimes been jarring. And I completely understand that. But theologically, I don't see much difference between what I'm saying and sort of a kind of traditional Christus Victor view of atonement. But if you find holes in that, then that's fine. So going back to the days, day 5 we have walking on water. So in day 5 we have the creation of the great fish of the sea, the chaos monsters, the Tananim. So I think that's fairly self-evident. Jesus walks on the water. If day 4 was complicated and I had to sort of scramble around for some sort of way of understanding it, day 5 is clear as day. He walks on the water. He has authority over the chaos monsters. In day 6, so this is the image of God. This is when humanity is created in Genesis. And Jesus heals a man who's born blind. And Jesus, in this story, is everything in the creation. He's God, really. Like the ways in which he talks in that story in John 9 is really interesting. He says that he's the light of the world. day one language again. He says that he works in the daytime as opposed to the night, so he sort of invokes some day four language. And he tells the man to wash, which is, water language as well. And how he heals the man is really interesting. He does it with mud. So he spits on the ground, he forms the dirt of the ground into clay and puts it on the man's face, which might remind us of the ways in which God crafted Adam. He molds him out of the dirt. You remember we talked in terms of, we used idol or statue language, where God crafts Adam out of the dirt and molds him and forms Adam and then breathes into his lungs the breath of life. Jesus is kind of doing a similar thing with this guy who is born into the state of Adam. He is a fallen human being. And what Jesus does is take mud and put it on his face, and he sort of starts to mold him, and he heals him, and he's sort of putting him back into something resembling the image of God, at least. And then we have the raising of Lazarus. I'm not really sure whether the raising of Lazarus is day 7 per se. I think the raising of Lazarus may be more a prophetic act, looking forward to Jesus' own resurrection, but also looking forward to the raising of all humanity. So we've already seen how Jesus instigates a new creation through the cross, or I think he does at the very least. He transforms the tree of death into the tree of life. And I want to now look at how that new creation starts to manifest itself through the resurrection and beyond. So I think what happens from this point on, so you notice that the raising of Lazarus is before the crucifixion. I think that what we get with this new week of creation that Jesus starts at the cross is another 7 signs. More signs of this new creation that also parallel the days of Genesis. So this is a Greek word, semion. It's the word that John uses for these signs. It's the word that he uses, say, with the water to wine. This is his first semion. It's a really interesting word because in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, so the Septuagint is a Greek version of the Old Testament, translated because Israel has become Hellenized. So there's so many Greek-speaking Jews around that they want a Greek version of the Old Testament. So this is translated a couple of hundred years before Jesus. It's in wide circulation. When Paul quotes from the scriptures, he always quotes from the Greek. So this is like a widely known version of the Bible. And the word semion is the word that the Septuagint uses for the pole on which Moses raises the serpent. That's interesting. It's also the word that Isaiah uses. Do you remember we talked about standards and signal flags that are raised up on the mountain of the Lord, that draw all the nations? And Jesus invokes this kind of idea in John 12 when he says, I will be raised up from the earth and I will draw all people to myself. It's a semion, it's a sign, a standard that's raised up. And all of this points to the cross. The pole on which the serpent is raised, the standard that draws all people, this is what Jesus is lifted up on. So if John is talking about signs, like the water into wine is a sign, the healing of the official son is a sign, the careful reader of John will think the main sign here really in this book is the cross. This is the sign, this is the semion. And the cross even has a literal sign pinned onto it, right? It says, here's Jesus of Nazareth. I can't remember exactly what it says. Here's Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he really is the King of the Jews as well, by the way. So I know that I talked previously about how he wasn't the king that people wanted him to be. That doesn't mean that he wasn't the king. It just means that he wasn't the king they expected. He literally is the king on the cross. And Justin Martyr makes the same connection, right, between the bronze serpent that Moses lifts up and the cross. He says that the bronze serpent is the sign, Samion, on which, and he compares it to the cross. So the cross, I think, is the first sign of a new creation. These 7 more signs in John, 7 further signs. And it begins at the cross and it goes through the resurrection and carries on. So if we have day 1, Jesus, the light of the world, John 1, he is the light. The light of the world is crucified. And he declares on the cross, it is finished. So the light, they're the opening words of God in Genesis 1. Let there be light. And now we have the light crucified, speaking, saying, it is finished. It is finished is something else that is multi-layered, I think. The old creation is finished. It is done. It is dead. It is gone. But also, the new creation that I am bringing into being is finished. It's completed. It's ready to go. And so these are the opening words of the light. We have the resurrection. Jesus triumphing over the power of death. It tried to swallow him. The grave tried to swallow him. The forces of chaos tried to drag him under. So the biblical authors and some of the Jewish texts, they'll talk about going down into death, going down into the pit, into Sheol. And they'll characterize it very often as drowning. And I think this is what Jonah is about. When Jonah goes under the water and he goes into the great fish, which is really a chaos monster, he says in the fish, I've gone down into the pit. He's spiritually dead at that point. And so Jesus is dragged under the water.
It was the only sign. That was the only sign that Jesus gave.
Yeah, he said it's a sign of Jonah. Yeah, it's the only sign that we hear Jesus talking about. Yeah. And so we have this sort of separation of life and death again when Jesus is resurrected. The waters have tried to drag him under, but he comes out of the grave. It's sort of an extreme version of the healing of the official son story. The waters of chaos have been overcome by Jesus in the resurrection. In day 3, we have Jesus appearing to the disciples in a locked room. Right? They're in a room, it's locked, the doors are locked, and Jesus is suddenly there with them. Now, day 3 in Genesis is all about physical stuff. It's the separation of the water from the land, and on the land you have vegetation and plants and trees and rocks, and it's all really physical. And to Jesus, this doesn't matter. Right? He comes through the walls of the house. It's immaterial to him, literally. In day 4, we have Thomas. And Thomas wouldn't believe until he saw. And again, day 4 is complicated. So I think to understand a little bit of what's going on in day 4 of Genesis, in day 4 of John's version, you have to go back to another appearance by Thomas in the story, to the resurrection of Lazarus. Thomas only appears at 3 points in the Gospel of John, and 2 of them are resurrections. And at one point in the Lazarus story, Jesus says this. He says, are there not 12 hours in a day? And don't forget that the sun and the moon in part regulate the day and the time. Like they separate the day from the night. So Jesus says, are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks around in the daytime, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of the world himself. But if anyone walks around at night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. So I was talking to Michael before we started, and we were talking about Thomas' response to Lazarus dying, and to Jesus saying, I'm going to go. And Thomas says, let's go with Jesus. And if we die, we die. Right? And I've always read that as Jesus encouraging the disciples, right? And being really gung-ho and full of faith. And Michael's read it completely the opposite. Michael's read it as him being sort of dour and sort of, oh, you know, what if we die? You know? So I'm going to go with my reading for now. But Michael's, I think, is as valid. It's hard to read tone of voice in the Bible. I think that what Thomas does is, in that passage, is respond with faith. And he's walking in the daytime, as Jesus sort of characterizes it. But what's happened by the second resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus, is that he's sort of flip-flopped a bit, and he's walking in the night now. And he doesn't have that kind of belief. He doesn't see the light. And Jesus restores Thomas' belief by appearing to him as the light of the world. He helps him to walk back into back into the daytime. Jesus, in that passage, has authority over the day and the night, and he controls who will walk where. In day 5, we're into John 21 now. Did anyone read John 20 and 21 before they came? A few people. Good. I'm sorry if you didn't. Feel free to grab a Bible from under the chairs and have a look, because we will be in John 20 and 21 for a few more minutes. So on day 5, the disciples are fishing and they haven't caught anything. And Jesus appears on the beach and he says, well, cast your net on the other side and you'll catch something. And they do, and they catch so many fish that they can't haul it in. Jesus has authority over the fish. It's day 5 language, the creation of the fish of the sea. And in day 6, he restores Peter in the image of God. So Peter, after Jesus is arrested, he's standing in the courtyard and he's standing around a charcoal fire with some people, and he denies Jesus 3 times. And now Jesus has Peter next to a charcoal fire, and he restores him 3 times. He builds him back up into the image that he was meant to be. I think there's a bit of a hint of day 7 as well, straight after that story. So what we get, I think, in Genesis, so in Genesis 2 you have the creation of Adam, and I think what you see after the creation is completed in Genesis 2, if you grab a bit of Genesis 1 language and apply it to Genesis 2, it's almost like day 7 is happening while Adam is in the garden and then he falls. This is a day of rest. God's finished creating, and God sort of leaves Adam to his own devices. And because it says that God is later walking in the cool of the day in the garden, and he comes across Adam and Eve, and they've sinned, and they're hiding from him. So if he is walking around in the cool of the day, that means he wasn't there before. So it's almost like this day 7, day of rest, an absence of God almost, where he's left. And you kind of get a hint that this is starting to happen in John, where Peter starts looking around at the beloved disciple, and he's like, what about him? And this is kind of what Adam does. Like, he takes his eye off the ball and he starts thinking about others. Well, in the sense that, in a negative way. He starts distrusting God. He starts listening to the serpent. And what happens in John is that Jesus sort of puts a stop to it before it can get out of control. He says, no, you just follow me. You keep your eye on me. And it's almost like Peter had taken the first step towards falling, but Jesus was fully present with him. And I'm not saying that God makes a mistake in the Garden of Eden. More that we see a progression and we see a difference here. This is Jesus instigating a new creation, one that he will not allow to fall, because he will be continually there. And this recrafting, particularly of Peter, but also of the other disciples in the image of God, is crucial. Because the original creation was always meant to be us and God in partnership, moving it forward. We use that image of a roller coaster that's supposed to be a great adventure, and it gets stuck in a loop-the-loop, and Jesus snaps it out. But that means that this adventure is meant to continue, that we are meant to carry on working in partnership with God and moving the creation forward in good ways, which means that we have to be recreated in the image of God. So the early church fathers talk about this a lot. So this is a quote from Athanasius of Alexandria. So he says that when a portrait is spoiled, the only way to renew it is for the subject to come back to the studio and sit for the artist all over again. That's why Christ came, to make it possible for the divine image in man to be recreated. We were made in God's likeness. We are remade in the likeness of his Son. This is the Incarnation. This is why Jesus came. He didn't just come to sort of triumph over sin. He came to restore us to what we were meant to be. And you'll find lots of other quotes from the church fathers about that kind of idea. And there are lots of ways in John 20 and 21 that Jesus recrafts people in the image of God. So we've already looked at Peter. I'm just going to look at a few more sort of briefly. I love that picture. I don't even know where it's from. I found it on someone's blog. So when Mary first comes across Jesus in the garden, who does she think he is? The gardener. You know what? He is, right? She doesn't make a mistake. He actually is the gardener. He's been raised to life in a garden. And he is rebuilding the garden. He is putting us back in Eden. And she's the first one to see him as that. When he appears to the disciples in the room, does anyone know what he does with them? What does he do? He says, "Peace be with you." And then he does something. He breathes on them. Sorry, Michael, carry on.
Breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit."
Yeah, breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." The pneuma, the breath of God. This is what God does with Adam. Right? He is a lifeless statue, and then God breathes into his lungs the breath of life. The disciples, then some of the prophets actually talk about this in this kind of language. I can't think who it is actually, maybe Jeremiah and possibly Ezekiel. They talk about God will take your heart of stone and restore in you a heart of flesh. This is idolatry language. Like the prophets and the Psalms talk in various places about you become what you worship. And if you worship idols made of stone and wood, you become like them. Your heart will grow hard, like Pharaoh's heart maybe, and it will go like stone. And what Jesus is doing is breathing into them once again, restoring them in his image. Like Athanasius said, we are made in the image of God, we are remade in the image of his Son. And it's the Holy Spirit. It's this breath that will never leave us. We have this within us. This is the gift that Jesus grants us. And also in that passage, Jesus invests them with spiritual authority. In verse 23 of chapter 20. So if John's Gospel is like the spiritual version of the Genesis account, it makes sense that the image of God in Genesis, which was given authority over the creation, over physical stuff, is now given a spiritual authority in John's Gospel. Later at the restoration of Peter, he tells Peter, does anyone remember what he tells Peter? What does he say? Okay, feed my sheep, that's one thing he says. No, I'll build my churches elsewhere. But he does say that to Peter at some point in the Bible, though. That's it. Yeah, he asked him if he loves him. The feed my sheep bit was part of what I wanted. So he says, feed my lambs first. And then he says, shepherd my sheep. And then he says, feed my sheep. Do you see that there's a bit of a progression there? A lamb is what? A baby sheep, right? So feed my lambs. And then they've grown into sheep that he must shepherd. And then he feeds them. And they grow, and you sort of imagine that it goes from there, right? They reproduce, and you have more sheep and like more lambs, and you feed them, and so on. This is kind of the movement that you get. Maybe this is John's version of be fruitful and multiply. Maybe this is Jesus talking to the image of God, Peter, and giving him responsibilities and telling him what to do in the world. I mean, the other gospel writers are really sort of explicit about it. Go and make disciples, right? This is the same kind of idea. Be fruitful and multiply. This image, this breath that you have, give it to other people. Bring other people into the fold. So we've said that Jesus, when he tells them to catch the fish, he's acting as the true image of God, right? He has dominion over the waters. But also he gives the disciples the same thing, right? He gives them dominion over the fish. If they're casting the net, if they're catching the fish, they're the ones that have dominion. And Jesus doesn't need the fish, by the way. He already has a fish on the barbecue, on the beach, right? He's already cooking fish. He already has authority. What he's doing is giving it to the disciples. It's not like he needs it for breakfast. He already has one. And it says, there's a really interesting line where Peter is on the boat. It says that he's got his outer garment on and that he's got nothing on underneath. Why would it say that? Right? Peter is effectively naked underneath his coat. Jews traditionally wore two garments. They wore like an undergarment and then a coat. So it's saying that he only had a coat on. He's naked underneath, and he's denied Jesus, so he is ashamed of himself. In Genesis, we have Adam, who it characterizes as naked and not ashamed. And then he becomes grossly aware of his nudity when he sins. He becomes naked and ashamed. This is where Peter is. Peter is naked and ashamed. And Jesus wants to bring him back to this point. He wants to bring him back to not ashamed. He wants to bring him back to being in the image. So Peter, when he hears it's Jesus, he jumps out of the boat into the water and he goes to the beach. And Jesus asks him to haul in the net of fish. And that's interesting because this is a net of fish that all the disciples together weren't able to haul in. And suddenly Peter's doing it by himself. Jesus is giving him dominion over the fish of the sea, like even more so than he's already given the other disciples. He's being remade into a full human being in the new creation. And breakfast might even hark back to Adam being given food to eat in the garden. You know, God plants an orchard around Adam, and the food is good for him to eat. Jesus is there giving them food. And there's this wonderful quote from G.K. Chesterton that I think sums up this whole kind of idea of new creation through the resurrection. So it's on your handout. Chesterton says, "On the third day, the friends of Christ, coming at daybreak to the place, found the grave empty and the stone rolled away. In varying ways, they realized the new wonder. The world had died in the night. What they were looking at was the first day of a new creation, with a new heaven and a new earth. And in a semblance of a gardener, God walked again in the garden, not in the cool of the evening, but in the dawn." So we're going to take a break. Go and grab yourself a drink, but I'd like you to do some work in the break. Is that okay? If your brains aren't sort of melted enough. Would you, either by yourself, if you'd rather, or in groups of, say, 3 or 4, or 2s, or whatever, do it however you like. Would you grab a Bible and read Revelation, whatever the last 2 chapters are, 21 and 22. So we started in Genesis 1, 6-7 weeks ago. I'd like to finish on the last page of the Bible. So in these last 2 chapters of Revelation, could you discuss or think about what's going on? What's being described? Is there any creation language that you see? Is there anything actually from anything that we've done that you recognize? Is there any temple language? Is there any Eden language? Is there any image of God language? Is there any chaos language? And just have a look at those 2 chapters in Revelation. And I'll give you a bit longer than usual. I'll give you 20 minutes until 9 o'clock. And then we'll come back and we'll discuss that a little bit until past, and then we'll finish. Is that all okay? Feel free to keep reading as I speak. It'll give you a nice distraction. So this is the last session, and this is the session with the least plan. This is why you haven't got a handout for it, and it's not planned kind of deliberately, because I want it to be dictated by you, really, where it goes. So I've given us the last 2 chapters of the Bible as kind of a hook, a foundation from which to start thinking about some of these ideas that we've covered over the last 6 or 7 weeks. And this is the great adventure. This is what we were always intended to go on with God, and what got stalled by Adam and Eve, or by us. I mean, Adam and Eve are all of us, right? And it's what Jesus offers us a chance to rejoin, to get back onto the roller coaster with him, and to go somewhere and to progress a beautiful new creation with him. So I've called this Nouvelle Vague, which means new wave. And so this is a type of cinema that you get particularly in the 1950s, and particularly with French directors, people like François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. And there were brand new ways of doing things, brand new ways of interacting with film. And I want this to be kind of your ideas as to how we interact with the world. I want this to be like a new wave of entering into the world. So Revelation 21 and 22. Okay, so let's start with a big question about it. What is it about? What is it talking about? What ideas did we have?
The end of the world as we know it, a new beginning.
Okay, the end of the world as we know it and a new beginning. Okay, when does that new beginning begin?
The resurrection.
The resurrection. You are a good pupil. Although you are sniggering, so I'm not... You are sniggering as you say it. So
No, I mean it.
you mean it.
I love the thought that at the resurrection, the body of Jesus was the first bit of the old creation that was made new.
Yeah, at the resurrection, the body of Jesus is the first bit of the old creation that's made new. I love that idea as well. Beautifully put. Yeah.
Beginning and end. Why is it not the end and then the beginning?
Yeah, why is it beginning and end? Why is it not then end and then beginning? Well, I think more that it's the beginning at the end. So it's the end of something old and the start of something new. And I think that's what we see through the cross and the resurrection. And I guess it's what Elaine's getting at, and what David's saying, that this is the start of something new. So, I mean, what is the focus of Revelation 21 and 22? What is the city? What is the bride of Christ? Jerusalem, New Jerusalem. What's described as the bride of Christ elsewhere in the Bible?
Church.
The church. Could this new city that John sees coming down out of heaven be the church? Does anyone have an issue with that idea? That's encouraging. That's really good. The bride of Christ is the church. It's the New Jerusalem. Yeah. So throw some ideas at me. Like, what language do we see in there of stuff that we've covered? What kinds of things have you thought about?
The city is a temple.
The whole city is a temple. Okay, so we did.
but they've got like replacing the role that the temple had.
So God himself is the temple. Okay, yeah, I like that. What else is the temple according to the Bible, according to the New Testament? Is there anything else that takes the place of the temple?
The temple of the Holy Spirit.
We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So perhaps you see there an idea of this partnership between God and humanity, where Revelation describes God as the temple, and elsewhere it describes us as the temple of the Holy Spirit. Maybe we are both meant to be the temple. This is a picture that a friend of mine drew, which I find just so profound. This is us, right? This is us now. We are the temple. Which, if you think about the kinds of language that we used when we were talking about the temple that the priests walk in ancient Israel, that makes some very interesting kind of leaps and conclusions. We are the center, the starting point of a new creation, perhaps. Do we contain the very essence of heaven within us? We talked about the Holy of Holies being symbolic of heaven in the temple. Is that now within us? Living stones. Yeah. Is there anything else that we saw in Revelation 21, 22?
Water.
Water. What about water?
Well, flows from the temple, very much like Ezekiel 7, and wherever there's fruitfulness on the side of the river.
Yeah, so in Ezekiel, is it 37? Yeah. The river flows from underneath the temple, from under the throne room of God, out to the world. And you see the same idea in the Garden of Eden as well. You have rivers that leave the garden. And it talks about things like gold and good things being further away. This is good stuff that is being flowed to. The Eden is described in sort of temple terms there. And in Revelation we have this idea that this new city, this new Jerusalem, there are rivers flowing out to the rest of the world. What else do we see?
When we cast up when there's no sea.
When there's no sea. Okay, interesting. So what do we think that means, where it says there is no more sea? No chaos. This is what the church should be, where there is no chaos within it. It is ordered. There is no more sea.
And there is no more need of sun and moon. The glory of God replaces that.
The glory of God replaces the sun and the moon. Yeah. We have the right to the tree of life. Yeah. Yeah. So we have the tree of life on either side of the river, to which we have free access. And its leaves are for what? The healing of the nations. This is the Abrahamic blessing and hope that we talked about. They are to be a blessing to the world. And this is what the church takes on. We are to be a blessing to the world. And we offer the leaves of the tree of life to the nations.
Why would the nations be healing? Or why would there be nations in the new dispensation?
Why are there nations in the new dispensation, and why do they need healing? Well, you answer that then. Okay, so I think that this is the church, and I think this is talking about how the church should be. And we know there are nations around us. We know there are nations is a way of talking about people who don't know God, basically, and being drawn to the light. It's this Isaiah image again of being drawn in. And interestingly, the New Jerusalem, it says its gates will never be shut. And so people are always free to come in. I mean, they're free to leave as well, which is interesting. But if you only think about this as an end time sort of this will happen at some point in the future, I think you start to run into problems then.
This is why I think what David said, the new creation began with raising of Jesus from the dead. And this is a picture of what ought to be going on at the moment, as well as how we see it completed in the future.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Michael. I think that this is what should be going on. It starts with the resurrection, and this is, John writes in very much an active tone of voice. Like, it's ongoing. You'll notice that he sees the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. Does he ever see it land? No, this is kind of the now and not yet dynamic of the kingdom. We are meant to be bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, but we do not see its full fruition yet. So, this is the church. This is how the church should look, but it's not fully realised yet. Does that help a little bit, Jeff, or not particularly? No.
And looking backwards and forwards, I accept that. I was just thinking, then why does Jesus need to come back?
Why does Jesus need to come back? It's an interesting question. What do we think?
Because it's not completely.
It's not fulfilled completely. So will the kingdom of heaven fully land until Jesus returns? I don't know.
No, there'll always be a vacuum.
There'll always be something lacking, maybe. Yeah, perhaps. I think that would be the classic answer to that notion that we are the image of God. We, as Adam should have, are not quite earthly creatures, and we're not quite God. We hover somewhere in the middle. We are divine mediators, and we are to bring the kingdom of heaven to the earth, and we are to represent the earth to the kingdom of heaven. But we can't do it on our own. We need the power of God and the power of Jesus.
That's in a throwaway line. It's a bit like realised eschatology.
Is it realised eschatology, though? I'd think of it more as realising eschatology. This is an ongoing process. I mean, it depends what you mean by realised eschatology. I mean, I think that Jesus instigates a new creation. I think that we are part of it. I think that we are recreated in his image. And our responsibility and role within the world is to draw other people into that kingdom. If you think that means that I am dismissing the idea of a future return of Jesus, or I don't know, really a parousia of some sort, then I don't intend to. My intention is to say that this is what Jesus begins, and he tasks us with bringing it more and more into being in the world. I think that is a fairly biblical idea. I hope it is. You may continue to be dubious about that. Do you disagree that the New Jerusalem is the church?
I'm not convinced.
You're not convinced?
It could be a restored nation of Israel.
It could be a restored nation of Israel.
It is the bride, though.
It is the bride of Christ. And it's built on the foundation of the apostles. The 12 apostles, so does that include Judas?
He's replaced by Matthew, isn't he?
Well, yeah, he's replaced in Acts by the drawing of lots. I mean, maybe you could say that it might include Judas, maybe, because Judas is also restored and redeemed. I don't know. Maybe you don't want to say that. But I suppose if you want to talk about restored Israel, you could say maybe that's built on the foundation of the apostles. I don't know.
I'm sure there will be included, won't there?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so Paul in Romans 9-11 talks about the possibility or the expectation that Israel will be returned back into the fold and regrafted onto the vine. So what? Yeah.
It's saying that Jesus will as well as us being the bride of Christ, which I agree with, we are New Jerusalem. Coming soon.
Yeah, so Jesus does talk in Revelation about he is coming. Right, so you have this, and this the now and not yet. So the dwelling of God is now with men. The Holy Spirit dwells within the church. But Jesus says, I'm coming soon. Right? You have both. And I think it's possible to hold both in tension. And saying that the dwelling of God is now with men is not saying that this is the end time absolute fulfillment of the new creation, because we see around us that it isn't. And if you use your eyes, right, and your senses, this is not the full kingdom of God. But within the church, we have the dwelling of God, and we have the potential of this. And we are meant to be building it, and Jesus is coming soon, he says. There is a balance to be had. Thank you, that's helpful. Was there anything else that anyone picked up?
The cherubim guarding the way to the tree of life.
Yeah.
Genesis.
Yeah.
Well, at the resurrection, there were angels again, weren't there? This time.
It's not in John, but yeah.
No, but the stone was rolled away.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
You can say it's like the way to life was open.
Yeah, I really like that. So we're talking here about, for those of you who didn't catch that, saying that cherubim guarded the way to the tree of life. And at the tomb, I can't remember which gospel it's in. Is it Luke, perhaps? You have angels who are there when the stone is rolled away. And are they reopening the way to the garden? Yeah, beautiful.
It says that the way to the tree of life was open here. In Revelation.
Yeah, the way to the tree of life is opened in Revelation. Yeah, and this is what the church has access to. And this is what is so remarkable about us being the body of Christ on earth. Like, if we're talking about the Incarnation, if we're talking about this is what Jesus comes to accomplish, we are now the Incarnation in many regards. Like, we incarnate ourselves within the world as the body of Christ. How does that affect how we act as the church? How does that affect what we do? And you have, I've got a Bible anywhere. So I really love verse 17 of chapter 22. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let everyone who hears say, come. And let everyone who's thirsty come. Let everyone who wishes to take the water of life as a gift. It's a gift, right? You don't grab it. It's given as a good gift. The Spirit and the bride say, come. This is God and the church working in partnership. This is what was always intended. We work with God to effect the kingdom of heaven on the earth. Yeah.
Your question was, how should what we know affect how we behave?
Yeah. How does it affect what we do from here?
Everything we do should be an invitation to Jesus, to accept Jesus. Everything we do should be attractive, like fruit.
Yeah, everything we do should be attractive to people. And we should offer them the fruit of the tree of life.
Yeah.
Right? There's no condemnation. There's no, it depends how far you take that idea, but we offer life. And we offer life in its fullness. This is what the church should be offering. And how do we practically do that in the world? How do we treat the world, actually? Like, if we ignore people for a second, how do we treat the world around us in this context? We're the image of God. We should care for the creation. And we should lead the way in that. We should set examples. Like, even just little things, like Like not throwing away too much plastic and that kind of idea. Like really, really little things. We set examples. What do we do to care for the world? I think that Christians haven't led the way in that as much as they should have.
We reverence it and rejoice in it.
Yeah, we rejoice in what God has given us.
Rejoice in the good that we see.
Yeah, and we draw out the good that we see as well. We reference it and we celebrate it. Because what God has created is good, and what we are helping God to create should be good. Are there other ways in which we can act as the body of Christ in the world?
Just day-to-day, going through life. Just natural. Taking your neighbour a chicken at the bottom.
Taking your neighbour a chicken. loving your neighbour. Yeah. And Jesus talks about that, right? Like he's asked what are the two greatest commandments, and he says, love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself. And elsewhere he says about if you've fed the hungry, if you've clothed the naked, if you've done all this for me, you've done it for God. Loving your neighbour, in part, is how you love God. It's how you act in reverence towards God by loving those who are also created in his image. Are there ways in which we can suffer for the world, as Jesus did?
I think identifying with the world's trauma, identifying with people's suffering.
Yeah. Identifying. How do we do that?
Well, I think sometimes instead of, if you take someone who's just had a bereavement, most people would be frightened going near to them. But I think we ought to be people who don't have to say a terrific lot, but who will listen. So that in a sense is Christ coming to people in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I really like that. Standing alongside people who are suffering, who are bereaved, who have trauma, who are the poor, the marginalised.
Yeah.
Like you see, have you heard of Eden projects where people go into inner cities? There's one in Openshaw where Christians will go in and they will live alongside the poorest of the poor, and they will suffer with them and they will live with them. They don't just sort of reach in from outside and give them a helping hand. They are in there suffering in the muck with them. They are being incarnated in the world. They are the image of God, acting as they should.
I remember somebody speaking about the message, and they went to the living shop. This couple who just went through, through the letterbox and they suffered. But they kept singing this song, I get knocked down, but I get up again. It's just like,
Fat Boy Slim. Yeah, they get knocked down and they get up again. Yeah. And I guess how do we do what Jesus tells Peter to do? How do we feed the lambs in our community so that they grow into sheep, and then shepherd them and then feed them, and make them into disciples who will do the same for others? What is it that we're doing as individuals and as a church that feeds our community? Doesn't just set out to sort of convert them with you are a sinner and you must be saved from your sin, but actually feeds them with the fruit of the tree of life, maybe. And yes, that sort of conviction of sin is important, but there has to be an offer of life with it. What are we doing?
I think the whole Connect thing has been a remarkable illustration of community, serving community.
Yeah, so our Connect building in the middle of town is really useful for thinking about this sort of thing, because as a church, we are very much on the outskirts of the town. It's very difficult for us to sort of get really involved in the community of Marple, but we have this building in the middle, Connect, where we have drop-in centres and all that sort of thing, and that is, it's almost like an incarnation in the middle of Marple. Like this is the body of Christ working in the middle of the town, which is really wonderful. I think we'll finish there. It's 9:20. I'm tired, really tired. Was there anything that anyone else wanted to say before we finish? Ian?
Pentecost and creation narrative.
Oh, just a small question. How do we fit Pentecost into the creation narrative? Well, Pentecost is fascinating. I mean, what Jesus does with the disciples in John 20, where he breathes on them and gives them the Holy Spirit, that kind of happens in a permanent, sort of explosive way at Pentecost. And this is part of their being recrafted in the image of God. We see like Tower of Babel language in there as well. So we talked briefly a few weeks ago about how the centre of creation to chaos at Babel is characterised by them having one unified language and then being scattered by God. At Pentecost we see the reverse of that, where people of all languages come to Jerusalem, the light of the world, and they understand the disciples. The disciples speak a unifying language that appeals to all cultures and appeals to all nations. And so I think that at Pentecost, maybe more than any other place in the Bible, you see the church instantly acting as it should through the power of the Spirit, where they draw the nations to Jerusalem. This is a fulfillment of Isaiah at Pentecost. Does that kind of answer it doesn't really answer your question, does it? That was just me on a rant. What do you mean exactly? Like, how, if the Spirit...
7 days of creation.
Yeah. Oh, so what's Pentecost in the days of creation? Oh, I don't know. I mean, Acts isn't written by John, so Luke doesn't use the same kind of ideas as John. Luke is more interested in other language and other images to describe the things that he's doing. He does use bits, like he talks about Jesus being with them for 40 days, which might parallel like the years in the wilderness and that kind of idea, and they're moving into the promised land. But he doesn't really use new creation language as much as John does. That's not really very helpful either, is it?
Big questions, isn't it?
Yeah, they're big questions. It's late. Did anyone else have any comments or anything else they wanted to say before we finish? And we'll finish with a song, maybe. Let's finish with a song.
You've done good.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, and thank you again for coming and sticking with it. And I hope you've got something out of it. Even if it just gives you something to mull over. And as I said at the start, I feel like what might happen with this is that it ripples out slowly, because I've gone at a fair clip. Like, I've gone through this material ridiculously quickly, really. What I hope is that it sort of marinates with you. And if you find yourself disagreeing with it, with any aspect of it, fine. But at least you'll have mulled over it. Please at least do that. Please at least think about it, and think about some of the aspects of the stuff that I've mentioned. And yeah, thank you for coming. And shall we finish with a song? Thanks, Philip.